Okay guys, so in this video we're going to have a look at some of the different attempts to classify and categorize different national cultures, and certainly the most famous of these attempts was that of Geert Hofstede and his cultural dimensions. Now, as you can see there, Hofstede, despite being a famous Dutch researcher, he's also a massive Saints fan. Well, he loves his beanie there, and he's also a big fan of music festivals. There he is. He is a bit of a loose unit, old Geert. His most famous work was that which he conducted in the late 60s, that's where it began, where he looked at 116,000 people that worked within IBM, where he was working at the time, and these people were dispersed across 50 different countries. In his attempt to classify different national cultures, he proposed 4 different value dimensions on which he said we could attempt to categorize these different cultures. And they were power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism versus collectivism, and masculinity versus femininity. In the decades after that original research, a number of different authors, including Hofstede himself, have attempted to refine that original work, and as part of that refinement, 2 additional dimensions have also been added, and these are long-term versus short-term orientation, and finally, indulgence versus restraint. Now, if you click on that link down at the bottom there, you can have a look at the full outline of each of these different dimensions, but we're going to briefly go through each of them in turn today to give you a better understanding of this key seminal work. The first, as I mentioned before, is that of power distance. Now, this refers to the degree to which the less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is going to be distributed unequally. So it's effectively how okay are we as a national culture with the fact that there are going to be some richer people and some poorer people living within the one community. And certainly here in Australia, we rank quite low here. That is to say that we do not accept that it is okay to have rich and poor people within the same society. Clearly, we still have a long way to go in terms of achieving full equality within our society here in Australia, and in fact it's unlikely that we'll ever get full equality, but we don't accept it, which is the key point according to Hofstede. In contrast, if you have a look down in the picture there, a country like Brazil scores quite strongly here, and that's evidenced by this picture here, where you can see a very posh high-rise apartments, or series of apartments with their own private tennis court and a nice swimming pool, living literally on the opposite side of that wall to a slum. So it is very much commonplace in Brazil, and at least to a certain extent widely accepted, that you will have that difference in sort of social classes and groups within a particular society. The second dimension is uncertainty avoidance, and this is the degree to which the members of a society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. That is, how much are we okay with what we don't know? And again here, Australia is actually relatively neutral. We don't hate the unknown and new things, but we aren't said, at least according to Hofstede, to be completely against it either. This is quite different to a country like Japan, for example, which scores very strongly here in that they do not like uncertainty and new things at all. The third dimension is individualism versus collectivism, and this is the degree to which a culture emphasises individual goals and success over collective goals, or the other way around. Not surprisingly here, Australia scores very strongly on individualism. We celebrate success here in Australia. We promote and very much encourage people to strive to do their best and to achieve individual goals and successes. On the other hand, on that dimension, if you look at a country like Pakistan, very, very much a collective oriented society here, where the collective goals and successes are much more prioritised over those of the individuals. The fourth dimension was masculinity versus femininity, and this refers to either a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness and material reward for success, which is of course linked to the idea of masculinity, or the preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for others, especially those less fortunate, and the overall quality of life, which is linked to the idea of femininity. Here, Australia is relatively neutral, a bit more oriented towards masculinity, according to Hofstede. This is in distinct contrast to Japan, which scored very, very strongly on masculinity. They're at the complete opposite, or not the opposite, they're all the way towards the masculine side here. And on the other hand, we have somewhere like the Netherlands, which is very, very much skewed towards femininity here, this idea of looking after others and ensuring that other people who are potentially less fortunate than us are looked after as well. One of the common misconceptions here is that it is about being masculine or feminine in more of a Western conceptualization of these terms. It's important to distinguish it's not about being more of a man or a woman here, it's about the masculinity and femininity outlined by Hofstede, as you can see on your slide in front of you. The fifth dimension, and one which was added in subsequent years after the original study by Hofstede, is long-term versus short-term orientation. And this is a preference to either maintain time-honoured traditions and norms and things that we're used to while viewing societal change with very much a suspicious lens, which is a long-term orientation, or the opposite of that, which is of course to take a more pragmatic approach that encourages thrift and efforts in modern education as a way of looking forward and celebrating what we are achieving at the moment, which is more your short-term orientation. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, Australia is very much, according to Hofstede's research, a short-term oriented society. We are very much about living in the now and trying to achieve and be successful in the immediate future, at the least short to medium term. While on the other hand, you have a country like Japan, which is very much long-term oriented. They're very much steeped in tradition, their culture, and they value that tradition and aren't so keen to change that or are somewhat suspicious of any attempts to change that. The final dimension is indulgence versus restraint, and this is either the relatively free gratification of basic and natural human desires and drives related to things like enjoying life and just having a good time, which is of course what we talk about when we mean indulgence, or on the other hand the suppression of those same desires and regulation by means typically of strict social norms, which is of course restraint. Finally, in terms here, Australia scores quite strongly on the indulgence dimension, and on the other hand you have a country like China which is much more oriented towards restraint. So these are the 6 dimensions that Hofstede and the subsequent researchers have managed to outline here. And these can effectively be summarized in a table like this. This actually only considers the original 4 dimensions, and certainly, as I said before, if you jump on that the website of Hofstede's work, you can see the full 6 dimensions and compare different countries across those. But Australia there, as you can see, sitting up the top, and as I just outlined before, that's how we score across those 4 key dimensions. Now, unfortunately for Hofstede, the haters are going to hate, and there's certainly been a number of different studies and academics who've come out and levelled a number of different criticisms and outlined limitations of Hofstede's studies. The first and by far most prominent is that it was based upon, and certainly the original work, was based upon one single company, being IBM, as I mentioned before. So of course that means that it's going to be difficult to get a fully representative sample upon which to create findings that you can then generalize to the rest of the world. So a lot of people say that they're not truly accurate or representative of what national cultures outside of IBM, for instance, actually are. People have also accused Hofstede's dimensions of not accounting for within-country differences, especially in those multicultural countries. We talked in previous videos about how rare it was today for a nation-state or a society to have a single culture. There are some examples, like we mentioned before, with South Korea and Japan, very strong monocultural societies, but most, like Australia, actually have a number of different cultures that can be identified within that single country. So this isn't something that can be taken into account by Hofstede's work. The issue of cultural values changing, especially through migration, is another issue that Hofstede's work has been unable to account for. So we actually celebrate, as I mentioned in previous videos, multiculturalism here in Australia and the diversity that we see as a consequence of people coming, especially in but even out of our country. And this isn't something that Hofstede's dimensions actually can account for. They're quite static and don't allow for that dynamic nature that we see across most national cultures. Finally, they cannot also account for individual level differences. So when we talk about something like uncertainty avoidance, I might be not so against change and uncertainty, but the person next to me, still within Australia, might be very much against uncertainty and very much try to avoid that. So, of course, it is very, very generalised and simplistic in its representation of national cultures, and if we narrow it down to an individual level, that's another thing that just cannot take into account. So clearly there are a number of limitations here. It is important to understand at the same time, though, that it does remain one of the most influential concepts and models on national culture. One of the recent conferences, international business conferences I went to, there was a presentation of a study that effectively trashed Hofstede's dimensions. It just said there are all these limitations, there are all these issues that mean that it's not truly representative, and therefore it's got all these problems. And one of the people in the crowd said, okay, well, if that's the case, what is the solution in terms of classifying national culture? And they didn't have one. And that's because it is very, very difficult to come up with a fully accurate, hugely detailed and comprehensive classification for these types of things. So, sure, it is important to understand that there are limitations, but the fact that we still use Hofstede's dimensions so widely today, both within academia and also in a business context, highlights its usefulness to both practitioners and academics. Now, just to finish this particular video for today, one of the key attempts to address some of these limitations that were outlined for Hofstede's dimensions is the work of Ronen and Schenker, and where Hofstede attempted to identify cultural dimensions, Ronen and Schenker looked for cultural clusters. That is, they tried to examine which countries that may share many cultural similarities and therefore may be deemed to be psychically close, as they termed it. And their research revolved around the question of would business transactions between organisations that are psychically close be easier to conduct than those that are psychically distant. And in general, the answer to that question that they identified was broadly yes. So they therefore tried to group different national cultures into these different clusters, as they call them. So you can see in that dimension down below, the Anglo cluster consists of countries like Australia and New Zealand and the United States and a lot of Western nations. Latin American clusters, there was a Germanic cluster, Nordic cluster, and so on. And as I said, the main idea here was to try and identify these different classifications, which would potentially make it easier for firms to engage in business within or through identifying those that were psychically close to their own country. It is important to understand that, like Hofstede's dimensions, Ronen and Schenker's cultural clusters are not perfect. The fact that it was now over 30 years old highlights that fact. So each of these different attempts are useful in their own ways, and certainly for you guys, they'll offer key insights into understanding these key differences that we may identify from one national culture to another.